Welcome to the inaugural episode of Penang Institute's new podcast series called The Road Ahead, where we discuss contemporary ideas that can shape our shared future. Today, the concept of nation-states and its role in the current world order has been put into question in the wake of major structural events that have shook the world. The major supply chain disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the inflationary upsurge that has affected pretty much the whole world up until today, the protectionist fervor that has swept the West, and now the spectre of larger wars looming in the Middle East and Ukraine. All this begs the questions: is the world order actually working? Is the idea of the Westphalian nation-states nearing its shelf life? Is there still a chance for regional integration and a peaceful multipolar world? My name is Fazil Ransom, and today we speak to the Executive Director of Penang Institute, Dato Dr. Ooi Kee Beng, about his perspectives on nation building, on regional integration, and a multipolar world order. Dr. Ooi, thanks for coming to the show.
My pleasure. Good morning.
So, before we go into the real substance, perhaps if you can share with us briefly, how did your experience and exposure in your past lead to the formation of the ideas that you have today? I know this goes probably way back, but
well, my first career was actually as a journalist in Penang. So in that sense, I could say that my interest in discussing and thinking about politics and social formation and cohesion and so on started very early, but without much theoretical background and so on. Of course, my ideas then I didn't think go very far. But I remember leaving for Europe in 1978 on the plane out of Kuala Lumpur. I remember writing down. I still think I have the note somewhere.
Okay.
And today, when I look at it, I'm a bit struck by that at that early age I did put my finger on something vital. Which was how do you create cohesion in a society, especially a multicultural one.
What year was it, if I may ask?
1978.
1978, okay.
May 1978,
okay.
Actually. I was flying via Moscow to Stockholm.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you're suddenly coming from Penang, this little island city. You're suddenly going to be exposed to Moscow, and so, you see Red Guards everywhere.
Yeah.
But even before that, it occurred to me that what politicians as a class tend to do in a society is to try to create a socio-psychological atmosphere that suits them. So there's always a manipulation of society. I mean, I use the word manipulation, and it's always a negative term, but I don't mean it to be too negative.
Right.
Manipulation is part of human life, right?
Yeah.
And where we are talking about the political class, then especially at that time, 78, this is not very long after all the chaos we had in Malaysia and all the reformatting of Malaysia itself, the constitution, the parliament, and so on.
Right.
So it's maybe not that strange that at that time a young Malaysian boy would be thinking along those lines. What are the politicians doing in the long run? What are they doing to Malaysians? What kind of Malaysians are they creating? An obedient Malaysian, a regimented Malaysian, those things.
Right.
And then if you generalize it then to other countries, then you see that there's something common about it. And so if I use manipulation or regimentation at some level as a neutral term, maybe that could sit. But anyway, to answer your question more, so I think my interest in politics, nation building, if I use that vague word, and in political history started very early. Not all that early. I was in my early 20s. Yeah.
Okay.
But I was off to Stockholm hoping to get into the tertiary education system there because the Malaysian ones were close to me at that time. So that was in that state of mind, I think, that I left Malaysia. Right.
Okay.
I was going out to the world to learn about the world so that would have something to say about Malaysia.
Right.
If I put it that way today. And then all my studies, when I look back about it, it's not only political. I went very much into philosophy, into sociology, and so on. So in a way, I did realize, and this is thanks to the European way of education as well.
Right.
You get rather holistic, and in a welfare state like Sweden,
yeah.
where education is free, once you have a job outside, you can continue studying. So studying was my hobby, right? So going to the university and finally getting a PhD, that was my hobby. My career was working in Ericsson.
Right. Okay.
So if I put it that way, and that's why I spent so many years in academia as a hobby. So I was touching on all sorts of bases.
Okay.
Right? In many cases, not very deep, but but more deeply in language philosophy, I think.
Okay.
So a lot of my political analysis today, in my later years, you can, if you know language philosophy, you can trace it back to that it comes out of that. That very new, exciting trend that Europe actually went through in the early the early half of the 20th century, even later, right?
Yep.
So that didn't happen here. In Europe, I think it was a cultural revolution in that sense.
Right.
In their philosophizing and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think, in the sense, I picked up on that kind of thinking. Yeah. And so after I did my PhD, even if going to the university was my hobby, in the end you do it too long, you're going to end up with if you're not careful, you're going to end up with a PhD. So which I did. And characteristically, symptomatically perhaps, right? And it's a PhD in sinology. Now sinology in Europe,
very interesting.
One of those traditional, when we look back today, they're not just area studies, because they're such broad area studies,
right,
touching on all aspects of a certain civilization. They're cross-disciplinary from day one. So I think that I took a lot of joy from and a lot of inspiration from.
Right.
So,
And this is very interesting, because at that time, China was not yet
No, it hadn't risen yet.
It's not risen yet, right?
It was still,
it's still very soul-searching in that sense.
Napoleonic age where, leave the dragon alone, and when it wakes, it will shake. At the edge of that, maybe.
Okay.
But not just before, right? China then was this strange alternative.
Right.
So seen from the Swedish point of view, China was back then an interesting place that you could go to for academic inspiration, because it was an alternative. It was different, and so on and so forth. So
from the Western models, and
I think the Swedish scholars back then found China interesting, and of course, even back then there was still a split. You like it or you don't like it, and so on.
Okay.
But back then, before China was seen as a threat, I don't think it's a threat, but I think the Europeans today want to see it as a threat, because they need a threat.
Yeah.
So even I think Sweden has been affected by that, which is very sad, because Sweden was always trying to be different in their approaches, right?
Yeah.
But those days seem to be gone, thanks to NATO membership, maybe, or whatever led up to NATO membership. Right?
Yeah.
But back then, the Swedish studies of China was quite important. Now, back in the day, in colonial times, now Sweden wasn't much of a colonial power for a long time. It wasn't really, right? Only in the early days. So they had a lot of missionary work in China. So they had a connection to China, the way the German states also had, in that here was something to inspire philosophical thinking, Leibniz and so on. So even from Sweden's side, I think there was a bit of that. That's why you had certain famous Swedish sinologists. So without planning to, me, this Chinese boy from Malaysia, got caught in this Swedish China interest that goes back to 300 years, right? So, but it's interesting also in that sense, when you enter into worlds that are not yours.
Got it.
You learn things that you otherwise wouldn't learn. Right?
But I think I guess what's interesting is you came from a very parochial milieu, i.e. Malaysia, to a more exposed, hugely critical in terms of coming up with great different ideas, philosophical ideas, but also institutions were starting to take shape in a very strong way in the West. And also then you move into China, which is in a way going back towards an alternative thinking. I think probably in your head that you're always looking for alternatives. You're not satisfied with what the development that you see as it is now. You always wanted to see how we can upgrade it. Maybe that's where you are looking at.
I understand what you're saying, Fazil, and largely I agree with it, but I would put in a caveat here. One might think Penang is parochial, and of course it's parochial being an island and all that, but Penang is not Alostar. Penang is not, Penang...
Actually, you're right, because Penang, by its nature, it's already cosmopolitan, right?
Yeah.
By its history.
So I would say that although I'm a boy growing up on an island and on the west coast of Malaysia, this island has
a different thing.
Yeah.
It has a different spirit.
I went to missionary schools. Now, what are these missionaries? They're global. They're part of somebody's global agenda.
Yeah, true.
And then Penang being part of the Straits settlements is also part of somebody's global agenda. So you had many layers of global agendas going on that we sometimes don't even notice very much, even Penangites, right? One thing I've learned in recent years, writing this book about my old school, St. Xavier's, it's that you have here in an island that the British took in 1786. This is English, Anglican, not Catholic. Catholicism was a bad thing in England. At the same time as they came here, the British took Penang, the Catholics, meaning the French largely, were being kicked out of Indochina.
But they settled in Penang,
so they came
which is
to Penang.
amazing.
So what you have here are Catholic movements, like the Westphalian movements, functioning within an Anglican system. Now that coexistence we don't give enough credit to.
That's true.
So Penang already started without thinking about the local multiplicity and the local complexity. Even just the European complexity is already having to live together here,
it's a microcosmic thing in Penang.
And that's not the full picture. You then have to think of the Eurasians, who since the Portuguese came and so on have been around. And so when Penang was founded, they also came here. And of course, many of them were Catholics. So we had that connection. But so Penang is parochial in that it's a small island.
Right.
But historically and in a global context, it is not.
It is not at all.
And that is why Penang, until today, within Malaysia itself,
it has still that DNA.
It has a cultural edge that other parts of Malaysia does not have, or they have it differently. Right. So I think so. Just to give credit to the fact that I grew up in Malaysia and went to school here, going out into the world wasn't that alien.
Right. Because you already had that kind of
you're not going to Mars, So even if I went to not to England or Amsterdam, I went to Stockholm. So that would be quite rather peripheral in the European context. Right? And yet it's not that alien because Penang never started out parochial.
Got it.
That would be my point.
Well, I guess perhaps maybe in that sense your the edge where you had this calling is also because you were comparing it. For example, how Penang has fared compared to the rest of Malaysia, for example, and where it's going. Maybe.
And what you said, I'm looking for alternative. I wouldn't see it as that, because alternative would. I found it hard to accept things at face value, if I put it that way. So of course you can say I'm looking for alternatives, but I'm trying to use a modern term now. I started out deconstructing. You don't take a word as a given. So although, say, I went to a Catholic school, the word God, the word salvation, the word sin, the word prayer, all those I couldn't accept at face value.
Right.
What do you mean by sin? What do you mean by who thought of the
idea
of sin? Prayer, what does prayer mean? Is it chanting, or is it begging for something? Or, I think today we use the word prayer even when we're just chanting. It's different. Prayer
has a different function.
Prayer sort of, you pray for something.
Yes, yeah.
But very often when we say prayer, we just mean a meditative chanting.
Chanting, yeah.
You know.
Which is a different function.
Yeah, it's psychologically a totally different animal.
Yep.
But you know, so as an example of how you have to look at every word and say, who thought this up, right? So if you start out unhappily in that frame of mind, you're not gonna have peace of mind throughout your life, right? Because every word that comes to you, you wonder what does this mean? Who thought this up for what?
Yeah.
You know.
I guess at a young age, you squeeze your brain just to think about all these concepts.
Yeah, and to give credit somewhere, I have to think of Penang and maybe my schooling, maybe the very diverse, ethnically and religiously diverse setting that the school, the Lasallian system actually provided, despite everything. And I do think, looking back at Malaysian history, that we do not give enough credit to the Lasallian movement. I mean, it's not in a good place at the moment. It might be strong in India and Philippines, but not here, for example. But you just scratch a bit, and you find that every other Malaysian is influenced by this. And these schools, they were not really religious on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
What they provided Malaysian boys and girls, especially boys in this case, is that the Lasallian movement was meant to bring education to poor kids.
Poor kids, yeah.
Not any kid, poor kids.
Poor kids.
So usually urban poor. And so that's why these schools are never really rich, because that wasn't the point.
Right.
But going to the poor, then the diversity is given. Your students are diverse, but you bring them to a common ground in that you give them modern education, and in this case they use English and so on, which is another point to bring up. Why were the Catholics using English? These are French, right? But being in Penang, you couldn't use French.
Right.
So actually, in the early days of the Lasallian movement here, they had to start bringing in people. When they started the Lasallian movement here in 1850 or something, together with Singapore, they brought in, where would you get English-speaking Catholics? You brought people in from Canada. You brought people in from Ireland, because these are the English-speaking Catholics. Right. That's why in Malaysian history and the Lasallian movement and the Catholic missionary movement, you see that they
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So the global lines that Malaysia that were here before Malaysia became a country should not be denied. But with nation building of a certain type, you start changing history. You start denying certain things, and very quickly you don't even understand yourself anymore, because you've denied your past.
That's true. And also, I guess, from your experience, I mean, Penang seems to be one of the deepest imprint on you, in the sense of what you have experienced. And it goes to show that, for example, you can be Anglican, but you can also embrace the Catholic movement within your dominion, and that's fine. So in a nation building context, I guess in the same vein, you can also argue that, the country can be an Islamic country, but it can also have enough space for all religions to thrive without any problems.
In a phrase, I think one wisdom that came out of all the wars the world has gone through as globalization began was that, religion has to be private. As soon as it's not private, it intrudes into politics, and if we are to have discussions in politics, and if it has a religious input in there, the conversation becomes difficult.
Very much, yeah.
And you mentioned Westphalia, and I think Westphalia was very clearly, if you have religion in politics, you will fight to the death. And that was
what happened in Europe.
And so they had to come up with something. We have to stop killing each other, and therefore we have to draw very clear lines on the ground. That's the Westphalia system, right? The nation state appears, and you start creating something called the nation state, hyphenated. And every word that's hyphenated, you have to look at, And I mean, those were many hundreds of years ago now. But what we should learn from that is that if we take religion seriously, it has to be a personal matter.
That's true. I think, I think this is where the soul searching of nation states, let's take Malaysia for example, needs to happen. And I think I want to just quote what you said about Malaysia being a introverted, narcissistic kind of outlook, always looking at itself rather than look at the beauty and the intricacies of the world in front of it. And I think this is where we miss a lot of chances, right?
Okay. Thank you, Fazil. It's a good point. I can think of a certain development in my own head over the years analyzing countries. I did, when I was in Stockholm, I did write a short paper where I cut up paths of nation building into isolationism,
right?
At the other end, globalization, and then
in that spectrum,
and then regionalism. That's a spectrum, right? Just to, at that time, this is the middle of the Cold War, so there were countries, especially communist ones, smaller communist ones. The big ones, of course, had their space. The smaller ones would try to isolate, and the isolation was then to build up something under a protective regime.
Got it.
In the hope that then you can become something and then become relevant in the world and so on. That, I think, in most cases never happens.
Right.
Isolationism is forever,
Yeah.
unless it gets broken, right? And then you have regionalism. Now, where is nationalism in all this? By having this three, I'm thinking that nationalism, at that time I never used the word narcissistic. In narcissistic, I use in the nation building context as a discourse limitation. You just see yourself, because you only talk Malaysia, you just see yourself. So even an empire like the USA, when you look at their national discourse, what are they saying? American interests, American lives, it's the same.
All about it, Very
so although they are a global power, their discourse is narcissistic, which leads me to the condition, isn't that a point in nation building to be narcissistic? So you see, back to my first question when I was leaving Penang the first time, back to this, what is it that nations do to their people?
Right.
They try to make them narcissistic. Right. You know what I mean? So even in Malaysia, I find it hard to be a patriot in the sense that it's Malaysian this, Malaysian that. So somebody's Malaysian so good, that guy is not Malaysian bad. What is this? So, having been born a Catholic, I didn't say that. I was born and baptized as a Catholic.
Okay.
I'm not a Catholic today. I don't. Okay. My head is somewhere else long time ago. But the idea of Catholicism is humanity itself, right? That's what Catholic means. You cover everything, right? But of course, that has come to mean just the Catholic faith. But if I use the word Catholic with a small c,
right? Okay.
That is important. It's what we mean by humanity, basically, right? So whatever discourse divides humanity, you have to be cautious about.
Got it. It's very interesting. So you mentioned about parochialism, nationalism, and would you say that this could be a way to hide our weaknesses? And using nationalism as a how do you say, as a pretext that you could actually obscure a lot of the bad stuff happening and create this diversion where people can have some loyalty to something, which is looking inwards. Maybe this is what we have been suffering from.
There are two things. That's a good point. Two things, if I may. Two things I learned living in different countries. That still sticks in my mind. One is that you get to Europe, 1970, and then Sweden especially. This is not long after the Second World War, 30 years or something, right? It's still there. The discourse is still there, and that discourse is that nationalism, because of Nazism, National Socialism. Nationalism is something to be careful about. And so in Europe back then, this is in the middle of the Cold War still, nationalism was not a good word. And I just came from Malaysia where nationalism is everything.
Is the everything.
So I thought, oh, what the hell's going on? Then, of course, this is one of those deconstructions you have to start to
Right.
do. You are being regimented.
Yeah.
You are being protected, quote unquote. You need protection. So to me, then, my conclusion would be that all these new countries, post-colonial countries, that came into being after the Second World War, they think of nationalism as good because it's an umbrella. It's a protection.
Yes. Yes.
At least you keep the colonialists out.
Yes.
So nationalism is good because it's not colonial.
Yeah.
And of course, after that, one could discuss in post-colonial literature. Okay, now you have
Now colonials are out.
yeah. Now
What
you
do you
have
think about this?
internal colonials.
Yeah.
Power is power.
Yeah.
So those discussions do go on. I think in India they had a much bigger kind of post-colonial discussions, more than we ever had. We hardly ever had it, partly because we were born right in the middle of the Cold War, and everything that had to do with class analysis and so on were suspicious because it might be communism.
But it's also obscured by the whole racial conversation.
Yeah. So
right?
it encouraged the racial side. If you limit class analysis, what are you going to have instead? So you fall onto identity
Yes.
instead.
Identity
At
is
least if
market.
you have class identity, it's not racial.
Yes.
Class
yeah.
identity is function, social function. So it wouldn't have been racial.
Yeah.
But because of how the NOC in which Malaysia was born, where class analysis was suspect, we ended up even worse within a racial.
This is what's happening in Malaysia today, I would argue. You know,
we
I
try
mean,
and get out of it.
the income inequality within races is wider than ever before. You know, we have this thing called Gini coefficient.
Yeah.
It's a measure of the income gap within societies. It's huge. It's getting wider and wider for Malaysia.
Yeah.
So I think, as you said, the real issue is class. It can be we should talk more about of a class.
If you go into economic development,
Yeah.
I tend to think that with the way racial politics developed in Malaysia, we went into welfare thinking more than development thinking. I think we got that balance wrong because of race. Now, if I may explain a bit more, if you think that why you needed affirmative action for the majority Malays, because they were urban, they were rural,
Yeah.
and because they not only rural, they were not brought into global economics the way the Indians and the Chinese who came from outside were. They were brought within that context of global trade, global colonialism, global. So they were more in that. Now, being rural, the Malays were not really brought into it, and the way the colonialism took place in Malaysia largely was this indirect rule. So we will leave the Malays alone as long as we handle their foreign affairs, so on and so forth, right? The adat thing.
Yeah.
And for the Malays, given the more feudal way of looking at power, adat was almost everything anyway.
Yeah.
So you are not colonizing me. You're leaving me with my adat and my religion. You can take care of the army and all that. I'm fine.
Yeah.
And you just give me advice. That's fine.
Right.
So
hence
you
the
have
residential system.
You have this sense that the Malays did not think they were very colonized, while the British thought they had colonized them, because in all aspects that were important to the global empire, they had colonized the Malays. But in all aspects that were important to the feudal system of the Malays, they had not been colonized.
Right. Difference of perspectives.
Different,
leads to different.
Interesting how that goes together. So that would partly explain why, when the Malayan Union came, you had this uproar from the Malays. And I'm sure for the British, what? We colonized you already. What do you mean? Well, the Malays say, are you trying to colonize us? I think there is that conceptual divide.
Got it.
In how power is exercised. In the global context, colonial context, and in the very local,
that's true,
Indic, I would say Indic context. Right?
I guess also that also, it was also the seed to why federation came about, because of the importance of keeping the royalties, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, in a way, I think we can say our federation is a federation of sultanates. Right?
Yes. exactly. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
you have 3 or 4 now you have 4 governors, but they're sort of second tier.
Yeah.
They don't decide. They're just there just to be
Yeah.
present, right? So the council of rulers is sort of that way. So, and
Yeah.
that's what we've ended with.
Yeah.
I think the boat has sailed for anything to change on that front.
Right.
So this is what we have. But given you see that, so for the Malay world on the peninsula, a federation of sultanates was okay.
Yeah. You are listening to The Road Ahead. But don't go away. See you in the next section.